Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Goodrich of Continuous Process Improvement Systems. I'd like to thank George Chow of Mannix for his collaboration on this project. Today's session focuses on NIST 800-171 Requirement 3.1.2, a key requirement for CMMC access control for Level 2 certification. We'll explain the requirement along with tools and best practices to help assure compliance. And here's our keys to compliance. We'll define the Control 312, cover shared responsibility with cloud providers like Microsoft GCC. We'll cover implementation in Microsoft GCC, including role-based access control, or RBAC. And we'll summarize best practices for the system security plan. We'll assess evidence needs and talk about documentation for your system security plan. The control says to limit system access to the types of transactions and functions that only authorized users are permitted to execute. This means A, define what transactions and functions users can execute, and then B, limit system access to only those authorized transactions and functions that you've defined. Control 312 is about access limitation and enforcing least privilege. First, you must clearly define user permissions, what actions and data they access or can access. Second, you must actively restrict system capabilities so users can only perform those actions and nothing more. Let's talk about shared responsibility with Microsoft GCC. The shared model states that you and Microsoft both share control responsibilities. Microsoft GCC, or Government Cloud, Community Cloud, is FedRAMP Moderate accredited, which is required for anything cloud-based. It meets CMMC cloud requirements. Microsoft's role provides secure infrastructure. And that's tools such as role-based access control, or RBAC, privileged identity management, PIM, and baseline access controls. Your role is to define user roles, approve access, manage RBAC, and document processes. If you use Microsoft's Government Cloud, Community Cloud, you leverage Microsoft's secure, compliant infrastructure, while Microsoft controls and monitors the underlying cloud platform. You're responsible for configuring user access, defining permissions, and documenting decisions. This shared responsibility is crucial. You can't outsource user and permission management. Let's look at customer implementation guidance. Role-based access control, or RBAC, to use this, assign users to roles, each with specific permissions. Restrict access by role, not just identity. Microsoft recommends RBAC for precise control. Group users by job role to only what they need. Read only, modify, etc. Privileged identity management, or PIM. You need to manage and administer elevated privileges such as administrative rights, enforce just-in-time admin access for highly sensitive or administrative accounts, and use PIM to grant temporary, closely monitored access with strict approval workflows. Customer responsibility is to define and authorize access to the customer system and to the resources. Remember, only your organization can assess, approve, and assign roles. Microsoft provides the tooling, but not the business logic. Let's talk about principle of least privilege. In this principle, users get access to only what they need for their job. An employee has rights only to functions and information needed for their responsibilities. no more or no less. For instance, contract management staff can update contracts, but not alter financial data. Assign privileges like create, read, update, delete per role, and limit that by time, device, location, or other attributes as needed. Permissions can also be time limited, in effect only available during work hours, or restricted by device location, or even customer or administrative requests. So when looking at access control, let's look at this from the NIST 800-171 point of view. Access privileges can be set by account or account type or attributes like time, location, device. Access control is not a one-size-fits-all. You can, and sometimes must, define restrictions per account or consider business cases. Examples of account types would be individual, group, guest, temporary, or vendor. For example, a vendor might get temporary read-only access. Consider time of day, maintenance windows, and remote travel scenarios when setting these. Access rules can vary based on when or where the request originates, and some rules might get more rights during scheduled maintenance or emergencies. Let's look at a practical example. Your defense contract team needs access to contract records, some of which contain controlled, unclassified information. What do? Let's collaborate with IT to define fine-grained roles and assign the least privileges necessary to assess or modify records. So use IT to define roles, assign permissions like read-only, read-write, or admin, and only designated roles access CUI. Access rights are reviewed regularly. Use formal processes, document, review, and adjust permissions at least quarterly, if not more often. Let's look at some of those procedures that you as an organization are responsible for. You need to document all access control lists, define role permissions, and require manager approval for access changes, usually through a change management process. You need to log account creation or modification, and you need documented procedures for everything. That includes how roles are created, how access is requested, and how permissions are granted, and how changes are approved and recorded. Let's say an assessor comes into your organization to do an assessment for CMMC Level 2 compliance or certification. There are some assessment considerations for limiting system access to transactions and functions, as there are for the other controls. You want to ask the question, are access control lists role or identity specific? Is user access limited strictly to required areas like accounting, or in effect accounting cannot access development tools? And are privileged accounts tightly controlled and documented? And what evidence will be required for assessment? Evidence goes beyond simple screenshots. Maintain lists of all user roles, describe their responsibilities, and show separation of duties. In effect, no single user has unchecked powers. Inventory, privileged accounts, and system admin personnel have good lists and record keeping. List and document all permissions. Have records of user access approval and periodic access reviews. Document all assigned rights and store records of every access approval, ideally with signatures and review dates. Remember, you should have an approval process, and this will likely be part of your change management process. Let's see what an example SSP entry for 312 might look like. We see the practice requirement itself limits system access to the types of transactions and functions that authorized users are permitted to execute. And the implementation status, is it planned, or if it's not yet implemented or partially implemented, or complete. Then the assessment objectives, also known as determination statements. This is the detail behind the practice requirement. So types of transactions or functions are defined. Access is limited per defined types. So we define it and then we limit it. Your system security plan should reflect not only the control, but specifically how it's implemented. And within that SSP entry, we'll see how shared Microsoft controls are listed. For instance, Entra ID establishes permission, Entra MFA for multi-factor authentication, RBAC and conditional access set role-based permissions and access, PIM for privileged user management, and Intune for in-device management. Devices such as laptops and tablets are otherwise vulnerable. Sentinel does scanning and handles security event management, and your SSP shows your organizational responsibility, such as access to the secure enclave is strictly limited and managed by change control. That's one of your processes, using unique usernames and tracked approvals. Monthly reviews of access logs are a good review best practice. To summarize, state your use of Microsoft Cloud Security features, how roles are assigned and tracked, and reference regular audits and reviews. Emphasize which parts are your company's responsibility and which are Microsoft's. This shared model must be clear for assessment. Okay, any questions before we move to the next control, 313? We'll stop the slideshow for a minute for everybody. Now let's look at NIST 800-171 requirement 313, another requirement in the access control family for contractors handling controlled unclassified information, or CUI for short. We'll unpack the requirement itself. We'll examine how the responsibilities are shared with Microsoft Government Community Cloud, and we'll review guidance for practical implementation. We'll discuss assessment, evidence, and organizational procedures. This is crucial for DoD contractors, particularly as you work toward CMMC Level 2 compliance. Control, or Practice Requirement 313, is part of the access control family. Basically, control the flow of CUI in accordance with approved authorizations. It relates to authorized transfer, transmission, or sharing. Let's look at information flow control policies are defined. This is part A. You may include this in your access control policy statement if it's a broader statement. Part B details ask for methods and enforcement mechanisms for controlling the flow of CUI are defined, so they're documented. Authorizations and admin are important here. Statement C designates designated sources and destinations, in effect networks, individuals, and devices for CUI within the system and between interconnected systems are identified. Your CUI flows and network diagrams are documented, and that's important here. D, authorizations for controlling the flow of CUI are defined, And E, approved authorizations for controlling the flow of CUI are enforced. So we define by documenting, we enforce, we review, we maintain this control. Your change control and administrative procedures are in place. And this requirement mandates that an organization controls the flow of CUI within and outside the organization. This isn't just about access, but about ensuring CUI is only transmitted in ways that are explicitly authorized. For example, this can pertain to where CUI is stored, how it's shared, and through what channels it flows, such as emails, cloud apps, downloads, and exports. The requirement aims to prevent accidental or deliberate siphoning of sensitive information. First off, what is Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI? CUI refers to any information the federal or government creates, the federal contractor or government creates or possesses, or that a contractor creates, receives for the government, requiring safeguarding or dissemination of controls. It's basically data requiring safeguarding and dissemination controls. CUI includes contract data, technical drawings, specifications, and more. If you receive, process, or store this information, you must follow the requirements of NIST Special Publication 800-171 and any DFARS clauses in your contract to ensure its protection. Shared responsibility with Microsoft. In a cloud environment such as GCC, security is a shared responsibility. Microsoft handles the physical, environmental, and infrastructure security of the government community cloud, known as GCC. You, the customer, are responsible for how CUI flows within your Microsoft tenant. You do this by assigning permissions, configuring sharing rules, and controlling external access. Also by enforcing policies and monitoring activity. Microsoft provides the tools, but you set and enforce the policies that govern the flow of CUI. So how do we implement a secure and compliant CUI system? First, let's map out CUI flows within your IT environment and through your GC services like SharePoint and Teams. Your business process is important here. Then implement restrictions based on who is authorized to access or transmit this information. Data loss prevention, or DLP, rules in Microsoft 365 can block sensitive info from being shared incorrectly. Conditional access policies can restrict where and how CUI can be assessed. For instance, preventing downloads to unmanaged devices. And make sure you ensure configurations are set to block anonymous links or sharing outside the organization unless specifically authorized. Within Microsoft GCC, real implementation tasks might include 1. Creating and assigning sensitivity labels, like CUI, to documents. Using data loss prevention, or DLP, policies to restrict emailing or sharing CUI outside of the organization. 3. Disabling sharing with guest or personal users unless approved. 4. We can set SharePoint and OneDrive to only allow sharing with authorized domains. And 5. Monitor audit logs for undesirable sharing or downloads and set up alerts for violations. These are just several examples. The assessment objective is to demonstrate CUI flow is controlled and per those defined authorizations. NIST Special Publication 800-171A provides assessment procedures for each control. Here, the aim is to ensure that policies exist for controlling information flow and that they're implemented in technical solutions such as Microsoft GCC and followed in practice within the organization. Assessors will examine, interview, and test to gather evidence of compliance. They'll look at your documentation, your policies and procedures. They'll also look at technical controls like data loss prevention and shared settings and configurations of your GCC high environment or your GCC high. And they may test the environment by attempting to share CUI in unapproved ways. They'll also interview staff to confirm everyone understands the procedures. So they could examine, interview, or test to gather the evidence for compliance. Now let's look at procedures and assessment considerations. Procedures are really documents allowed for methods transmitting or sharing CUI for this particular control. Include a list of authorized personnel. This list must be managed, reviewed, and maintained. And procedures will define approval process for exceptions. A strong procedure will clearly describe what methods of sharing, transmitting CUI are even authorized and defined or documented, such as uploading to a particular project site, emailing to an approved list, etc. And it'll define who has authority to grant exceptions or approvals. And it will define how these decisions and flows are documented. Assessment answers the question: are controls enforced and auditable? Remember that the reviewer can trace CUI flow and see evidence. The assessor will check not just if these procedures exist, but if they're active, meaning it's possible to see for any piece of CUI whether its current location or disposition matches what's defined and allowed by policy and procedure. So let's look a little more about what evidence is required in an assessment. Of course, we've talked about documented policies and procedures. Assessors will expect to see a paper trail, which is your written policies that describe CUI flow control. They'll also look at technical configurations from Microsoft GCC showing how settings enforce these rules. And they'll look at audit logs proving enforcement in practice. Remember too, exceptions are granted for information sharing. If exceptions are granted, you must be able to produce approval records. Training records for your staff on these policies also demonstrates that everyone is aware of what's expected, and this will be a requirement down the road. A typical standard operating procedure might begin by stating it aims to protect CUI in accordance with NIST 800-171 and DFARS requirements. Your SOP should specify which systems are covered, all CUI capable systems basically, and which personnel are responsible. These personnel are actually known as CUI assets as well. It should direct annual reviews of how data flows, require data loss prevention or DLP controls, make sure the controls remain current and configured within the system. It should mandate documentation of all external information sharing and define log retention. This sets a clear, repeatable process that helps your team comply and provides evidence during assessment. Remember, the SSP System Security Plan is actually a fairly high-level plan, and as you implement your procedures, there will be some required documentation in those procedures or that more detailed procedure within your organization. Expect to keep a good record of those. Let's look at common gaps, best practices, and risks. Risk includes uncontrolled data exfiltration, insider threats, and accidental leakage, to name a few. Risk, if this control fails, includes unauthorized leaks of sensitive information, whether by accident or malice. Common gaps or assessment pitfalls include poorly mapped data flows, say if you miss a CUI transfer route per your defined data flow. Common gaps, we're talking assessment gaps, also include a lack of evidence of approvals for sharing or misconfigured Microsoft settings, like allowing guest links in Microsoft. Best practice includes audit controls at least quarterly, automate enforcement and alerting whenever possible, and provide regular mandatory staff training focused on CUI controls. So in summary, 313 is focused on controlling CUI flow, its documentation, and technical enforcement and audit. NIST 800-171 Control 313 is about ensuring CUI is only shared, transmitted, or made accessible in explicitly permitted ways, which are approved by your organization and in accordance with contract and legal requirements. Microsoft GCC gives you tools, but the responsibility for configuration, for usage, and adherence lies within your team. Success requires both comprehensive and procedures and well-configured technical controls. Any questions at this point?